To the revolution!
To the revolution! To the revolution! To the revolution! To the revolution!
In the grand pantheon of fascist allegories that are routinely assigned in junior high literature courses, William Butler's 1961 novel, The Butterfly Revolution, is comparatively obscure. Part of that was probably due to publication issues with the book's distributor. But it's also hard to compete with Lord of the Flies and Animal Farm when it comes to middle school literary ubiquity. And you'd think having a movie adaptation would be helpful, but when that adaptation is made by Roger Corman, and the marketing is revamped to take advantage of the then resurgent teen slasher movie market, you can see why it might not be as helpful in bolstering book sales as you might think. That's unfortunate too, because The Butterfly Revolution and its flawed but interesting adaptation Summer Camp Nightmare are some of the most informative allegorical fiction when it comes to how fascist regimes form. All you need to raise a fascist society is exploitable discontent, a charismatic figure willing to capitalize on a situation, and plausible deniability. But, as a wise man once said, winning is easy, young man, governing is harder. This video contains spoilers, so consider watching the film first before you continue. And if you like what you see, click the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and make sure to click the little bell to be notified for new videos. Summer Camp Nightmare tells the story of a young boy who witnesses the fascist takeover of his summer camp by a charismatic young man and his cohort of accomplices, and comes to realize the horrors of fascism's barbarity only after it's too late. Now, Summer Camp Nightmare has the usual adaptation problems, plus a few additional self-inflicted issues as it tries to sell itself as an exploitation film. The way the filmmakers tried to handle this is by focusing on the meatball-style shenanigans for the first half of the film, and then speedrunning the fascism part. Unfortunately, without the lengthy lesson on fascism, the film just peters out without a so what, neither satisfying the slasher fans it was trying to trick into the theater, nor the fans of the original novel. That doesn't mean it's totally without merit, as the performance by Charlie Stratton as the calculating and charismatic Frank Riley is both instructive and chilling to watch.
What? You mean Mr. Warren? Oh, goddamn!
Just take it easy, Stanley. Let me handle this.
Donald Poultry is a 13-year-old fish out of water when it comes to summer camp. He's an indoor cat who's much more at home in front of his computer than among the trees. In the novel, the story is told as an epistolary, entirely through Donald's diary. Although in the original novel his name was Winston Wayne, and there's no discernible reason for the change to Donald Poultry, other than giving him the nickname Donald Duck. So I guess writer's prerogative on that one? I'll try to distinguish between Donald and Winston if I'm bringing up an important distinction between them. Donald tries to keep to himself as much as possible, recording his thoughts into a portable tape recorder. The novel makes it explicit that he's being forced out of the house by his father because Winston, quote, tries not to be normal, and his father thinks that this might cure him of that. Given that the novel was written in 1961, obviously Winston isn't a computer nerd. He's a book nerd. His mother is on their second read-through of the Bible with him, although Winston has already decided that he's an atheist. He prefers Herodotus and political philosophy by Thoreau, Thomas Jefferson, John Stuart Mill, and Karl Marx. God, no wonder his dad wants him out of the house. The bookworm aspect is crucial to understanding the character and his reaction to what's happening around him, which is sad that it had to be jettisoned for the film adaptation. The camp is run by Mr. Warren, a conservative old Bible thumper who is enthusiastic about collecting butterflies and lets the kids know it. In the film, Warren is played by longtime character actor Chuck Connors, who you probably know from the film Tourist Trap, but normies would know as the Rifleman. Warren runs a tight ship, banning alcohol, smoking, gambling, and anything past first base between the campers. And surprisingly, this fact alone is all fascism needs to take root. The older guys at camp include the conniving smartass Franklin Riley, Stanley the punk Runk, John Mason, played by Friday the 13th Chase and Lives alum Tom Fridley, Manny Rivez, Jerome Blackwood, and a Golden Boy character Chris Wade, who seems to be amalgamated from several of the book's characters. Also, the character of Don Egris gets folded into Hammond Pumpernill here, because Don was a black character in the 1960s who goes through some very black guy in 1960s sort of stuff. And the 1980s were not touching that with a 10-foot pole, because racism ended in 1968, as we all know. That change winds up sacrificing a lot of the book's thematic richness, but I'll get to that in a bit. The problem with the camp, at least initially, is that the older guys become disillusioned with all the rules. They thought that it was going to be more like the first part of the horror film, where they get to do the drugs and feel the titties. And instead, because of these butterfly hunts, their whole summer is going to be blown. Well, they won't be. So there's already this culture of grievance running through the camp, which I think owes a lot to screenwriter Penelope Spheris, who carved out a niche in understanding disaffected youth with the decline of Western civilization, suburbia, and later Wayne's World. At the very least, Spheris understands the punk rock edge running through every grumpy teenager. And that's something we don't really get to see in the book that we do get to see in the movie. Every time there's an argument about camp rules, we get a cutaway to Frank Riley looking on with barely restrained glee. Because the novel gets Winston's worm's-eye view of events, Frank is a much more distant, enigmatic character. In the movie, he seems like a rattlesnake, coiled and waiting to strike. So what breed of rattlesnake does it take to overthrow a government? In their groundbreaking work on personality disorders, Richard Christie and Florence L. Geis developed a cluster of personality traits and a diagnostic to measure Machiavellianism. Based on the works of Italian philosopher and author Niccolò Machiavelli, Christie and Geis cobbled together 8 characteristics that correlated with Machiavelli's power-hungry and cynical view of leadership. They include manipulativeness and deceitfulness, lack of empathy and affect, a cynical view of human nature, a focus on self-interest and power, a lack of concern for conventional morality and ethics, advanced long-term planning and strategic thinking, emotional detachment and a perception of invulnerability, and a low commitment to any particular ideology. The interesting thing is that Christie and Geis wouldn't publish studies in Machiavellianism for another 9 years after the publication of The Butterfly Revolution, but I think anyone who knows more than a handful of people probably knows someone who is Machiavellian. Estimates put high Machs at about 1% of men and 0.2% of women. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you know 100 people, you probably know a guy. Most of Machiavellianism's traits are present in Franklin, and the ones that aren't are present in the book version but cut for time. There's a funny, maybe unintentionally, subplot in the book about George Meridal, an ultranationalist and Christianist rival of Winston's in the Revolution, accusing Winston of counter-revolutionary thought because one of his philosophy books talks about Marxism. This makes Winston fall out of favor with the group, but Frank also tells the guys to start pooling their resources and seizing money from the kids in the camp so that they can support the revolution. In other words, Frank doesn't really hold any ideological beliefs himself. He sensed the tide was turning against Winston, so he threw him under the bus. And then, when it was clear that the revolution needed brain power and a potential patsy, Frank invites Winston back into the fold. Frank is puzzled, though, when Winston says he wants to make the revolution about something. Specifically, Winston comes to the conclusion that the revolution would benefit from what, in 1961, were some fairly leftist causes: racial equality, freedom of, or more accurately, from religion, and socioeconomic mobility.
Frank nodded.
Yeah, but if the revolution had to go on, and if it got bigger instead of smaller, if people began to like it instead of dislike it, then you think those things are really important, right?
It felt funny to have him ask me such a question. He is older than me, and why should he ask me what is important? They are just things I mean to fight for myself. Okay.
For Franklin, it's about people liking or disliking the revolution, not whether they share its values. And he seems genuinely perplexed that anyone would associate power with personal beliefs. You don't notice it in the movie because the story is so tight, but in the book this leads to the revolution being utterly chaotic. People are given power and then excommunicated on a whim. Policies are changed almost daily based on paranoia and reactivity. Everything runs according to Frank's mood, and, as Winston notes, Frank is the moodiest guy in the world. But more than that, it's the parallels between Frank and Winston. One of the most telling phenomena of the film is that many of the traits that Winston has in the novel are transferred to Franklin in the movie. Donald is a lo-fi tech nerd in the film, so politics doesn't enter into thought explicitly on his end. But in the novel, it's Winston who reads Thoreau instead of playing with the other kids. It's Winston who comes up with the rules for the cabins. It's Winston who discovers that overcoming pain is about overcoming fear. Thoreau's civil disobedience, by the way, is his declaration that the individual's moral compass should override the will of the state when the state is unjust. He made this case after refusing to pay poll taxes to protest slavery. And I suppose if you can corrupt Nietzsche to justify Nazism, You can just as easily use Thoreau to justify why you're entitled to finger-banging some girl across the river, and if the fulfillment of that entitlement means overthrowing the social order, then so be it. These changes completely alter the point of the book, though. In the novel, Winston struggles to understand many of his books, including this one. He knows he doesn't like Karl Marx because Marx seems to be anti-family. He does like John Stuart Mill and his humanist outlook, though. At first he embraces fascism, then he doubts it, then he becomes a pariah, then a counter-revolutionary. And most of his decisions are based on what he's reading at the time, whether it's the Bible or Thomas Jefferson or Thoreau or Marx or Mill. The point is, he only understands the world through his books. And when there's nothing from the books that he can understand, he doesn't comprehend the world around him. And Franklin serves as a darkened version of Winston. Sort of a dark Thoreau, I guess. Thoreau, by the way, tends to be a cornerstone of anarchist thought. He wrote Civil Disobedience at a time when the state was based on slavery, which he found abhorrent. So he reasoned that he didn't have to support the government by paying a poll tax. And yeah, why would you support a government that does something evil? If you're against financially supporting the bombings in Gaza, or abortion, or discrimination against trans people, or the curbing of gun rights, and your government enacts all these things, don't you have a moral duty to stand up to that government? And if the government is consistently corrupt and evil, don't you have a moral obligation to overthrow that government? Violently if necessary? But the thing is, I listed 4 hot-button political issues, 2 of which are favored by Democrats, 2 of which are favored by Republicans. And then there are the libertarians who say, they're both ass, just solve it with maximal freedom. And yeah, that sounds cool, but... And I know I'm going to alienate a lot of people with this one. There are 2 types of libertarians. There are the, dude, I just want to collect rainwater in my own house without paying a $500 fine to the city type of libertarians. And then there are the libertarians who say, no, 12 is old enough. So the problem with Thoreau is, what happens if the second type of libertarian is the one who overthrows the government? Because they believe in their thing just as fervently as the rainwater guy or Thoreau opposed slavery. What if his definition only involves negative freedoms? The freedom from interference from government. And then after that, all bets are off. Full-on anarcho-capitalism, social Darwinism. If you're smaller than him or slower on the draw, your stuff belongs to him now. If he finds your body attractive, it belongs to him now. If that guy overthrows the government, which he feels he has the right to do based on Thoreau, do you feel a lot of freedom then? But what does all this have to do with Franklin? Well, early on in the film, the guys are hanging out at the ravine, watching Stanley Runk throw his knife at the Forbidden Bridge, when Franklin decides to American Gladiator his way across the rickety bridge. Earlier, Mr. Warren told them not to go near the bridge to the girls' camp because it was dilapidated and dangerous. And clearly it is. But literate contrarian Franklin Riley tells the guys it's really just about social control, not safety.
The society keeps us in line by the use of fear.
Huh?
When we overcome fear, Stanley, that's when we stand above society.
The state, in this case Mr. Warren, is just using fear to keep the guys from crossing the bridge to get to the girls' camp. This is all a false flag, even though the viewer can clearly see that the bridge is dilapidated and dangerous. When Counselor Hines shows up to tell the boys to quit being stupid and trying to get themselves killed, the boys get sourpusses on their faces for being scolded. But yeah, the thing you were doing was incredibly stupid, and you were told explicitly not to do the incredibly stupid thing 10 minutes before you did the incredibly stupid thing. But the damage is already done. The boys see the Warren regime as some kind of oppressive, safe-scold monarchy, and Franklin is an iconoclast who won't let the man tell him what to do, and isn't afraid of the consequences. The seeds are planted. And that goes hand in hand with Franklin being willing to use people for his own benefit. He seems to know what everyone needs, not just collectively, but individually. Stanley Runk needs to feel like a tough guy. John Mason needs to feel like a ladies' man. And Donald needs to be valued for being smart. Not even recognized as smart, because everyone, including Donald, knows that he's smart. He needs an environment where his intelligence is valued. And Frank is always looking to seize an opportunity.
Donald, I knew you were a smart kid. Now come on up here.
There is an episode of the hit HBO show The Sopranos that deals with failed systems and the social contract explicitly, right there in the text, spoken in the dialogue, and yes, it's that episode. So, you might want to jump ahead. In the episode, Tony Soprano's psychiatrist, Dr. Melfi, is and beaten in a stairwell. Despite being able to identify her attacker, a cold and incompetent system lets the guy off the hook. And Dr. Melfi is left with the choice of telling Tony about it, knowing who would mete out literal mob justice, or suffering in silence, knowing that her attacker is celebrated as Employee of the Month at a local restaurant. Melfi generally looks down on Tony's lawless and corrupt way of life, but this episode makes her ask the question, isn't mob justice better than injustice? Stick a pin in that one. The first thing we have to acknowledge is that the boys of Camp North Pines have no real problems at the beginning of the film. The summer camp is set up to run exactly as it's supposed to. No summer camp promises you unlimited sex and drugs, unless it's one of those crypto bro scam festivals where there winds up being only one toilet. The boys are just upset because there are rules that prevent them from having the things that they think they're entitled to. They're coercells. But it's still discontent. There's no rule that says that it has to be morally or factually justified. That frustration is how functioning societies collapse into fascism. And just so we get this part out of the way, we're referring to fascism as far-right, ultranationalist, authoritarian political ideology. Let's try to avoid overcomplicating things more than we have to. Societies that strive to be equal and just need traditions and institutions. And those traditions and institutions are never 100% infallible. The law of large numbers says that there's always going to be a guilty man going free and an innocent man behind bars, a plane crashing on the runway, lead in the drinking water, and some form of income inequality just based on where you live and what your economy is based on. No form of government, no system of social organization is ever going to be able to protect its citizens 100% of the time, and certainly not from themselves. I'm going to make the first of a couple of recommendations here. Check out Innuendo Studios' I Hate Mondays video, in which he discusses the problem with binary thinking about social problem solving. It's a good primer for a mindset that blocks improvements in social programs and progress because of unrealistic metrics. Failure to achieve 100% effectiveness with a program is seen as being a 100% failure. And that's a perception problem. The thing that institutions have working against them and fascism has working for it is that no one really knows when society works.
I've been on food stamps and welfare. Anybody help me out? No.
And that brings me to my second video recommendation, Hank Green's excellent video titled, No One Knows When They Don't Die. The idea basically goes like this. You don't know if you are one of the 2,100 measles deaths in America that would have happened without the vaccine being invented because we've reduced measles deaths to single digits in the ensuing 60 years since its development. You don't know that you didn't die because a mechanic saw a faulty rudder on the airplane and delayed a flight to replace it. You don't know that you didn't die because the restaurant raised the quality of their disinfection routines, knowing that they could face a health inspection and/or a lawsuit. You just take for granted that you're not going to wake up with measles or have a fuselage fall on your cranium or puke your guts out from salmonella. And yes, as Innuendo Studios points out, those things still do happen occasionally. But social structures don't get the credit for those things not being the norm. And in the film, but especially in the book, there's a long stretch of seeing the benefits the summer camp provides. Everybody gets 3 meals a day. There is a lot of Kool-Aid distributed, which would become a weirder, more concerning thing 20 years later. There are tons of organized activities like football, swimming, and capture the flag. And until the kids at the talent show screw it up for everyone, there's a co-ed cotillion planned. It's not all butterfly catching. But the older boys want sex, drugs, and rock and roll, so they have a puss on the whole time. And this is where Franklin Riley exploits the system. First, there's a moment where All-American golden boy Chris Wade is trying to teach Donald how to swim, but Chris leaves to give him some privacy while Donald gets inspected for a rash. So when Donald jumps back in, the counselor is busy talking to the doctor, and there's no one there to save Donald when he swallows water and starts to sink. No one, that is, except for Frank, who is chilling reading Thoreau because of course he is. This is a good directorial moment from Burt Dragon, as Franklin peers over his book, watching Donald flail helplessly. Instead of simply alerting Chris, the lifeguard, or the counselor, any of which would have been easy enough, Franklin dives in himself to make the save and be the hero. The system failed Donald, but it failed because Frank didn't do his part in alerting it, because Frank wanted the system to fail visibly. This is driven home when Chris, Frank, Counselor Himes, the lifeguard, and the doctor are all surrounding Donald, and the lifeguard asks what happened.
What happened? Just doing your job for you, sir.
This is not just self-aggrandizement, though that's probably a nice bonus. It's the opportunity to undermine the system in a situation where everyone is watching. Even Captain America Chris Wade tells him they were lucky he was there. And that's how a good Machiavellian works. Franklin really makes anything happen at the camp. He just exploits opportunities. A similar thing happens before and during the butterfly hunt. As Mr. Warren is describing it to the kids, Franklin jokes with the other guys that Warren is a quote-unquote fruit, which in 1987 terms meant both gay and child. The two were often presented as synonymous. And when Peter, a young boy with a pants-wetting problem, comes back from the butterfly hunt, he says that Mr. Warren lifted him up to get a closer look at the butterfly, and Peter wet himself because he got scared. Franklin corrupts this story into Mr. Warren might be a to Stanley Runk, who just confirms his own suspicions about Warren's sexuality. So Mr. Warren, whose worst crime is being an old conservative fuddy-duddy, gets branded as an ineffectual pervert who is too busy targeting young boys to ensure the safety of kids like Donald. When you remember that Chuck Connors was a close personal friend to similarly old conservative fuddy-duddy Ronald Reagan, who was president at this time, the casting and the portrayal take on a slightly different meaning. Franklin does tip over that first domino, though, and he even announces to Donald that he's going to do it, but it's only obvious in retrospect. As the two are playing chess, Franklin explains that,
See, with just one clever move, you can instantly annihilate an evil force. Checkmate.
if you position your pawns correctly, you can strike at the heart of power. He then proceeds to get all the boys riled up by complaining that they can't watch anything but a knockoff 700 Club on TV, thanks to Warren's rules, and then he suckers both Donald and Golden Boy Chris Wade onto the roof to try to unscramble the naked channels. Of course, Warren comes back to the cabin and catches them all, prompting him to put Chris Wade on probation for his insolence and tomfoolery. Donald escapes similar punishment because he's so young and impressionable, but it was a no-lose situation for Franklin. Either his idea delivers much-needed porn to the masses, or the boys' anger at Warren grows. The discontent with the present administration is rife, but that would hardly be enough for an entire camp to go along with an overthrow of the adults. Unless the revolution wasn't a real revolution.
The revolution will not be brought to you by the shape of a war theater, and will not sound with words in Steve McQueen or Bullwinkle and Julia.
The problem with writing an allegory about the rise of fascism and setting it at an all-American summer camp is that it's a big ask to get the audience or the reader to go along with the idea that all or even most of the camp would capitulate to such a thing. This is one area where I think the film vastly improves on the novel, and it might just be due to cultural evolution. The ensuing 25 years between the publication of the book and the film's production saw Vietnam, the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, Reaganomics, and the Challenger explosion. Saturday Night Live, not necessarily the news, and countless stand-up comedians skewered politicians in irreverent ways that would have been seen as treasonous in 1961. So by 1987, we developed a little thing called nihilistic irony. As long as it was in service to the joke, you could say the racist thing or the sexist thing because you were pointing out how awful those things were. You were, in essence, just playing a character, and that character gave you plausible deniability. If it's just a meme, if it's only for the lulz, it can't hurt you. Twitter is not real life. And surprisingly, this is what gets a lot of people on board for the revolution. Either people participate in the revolution LARP, or everyone makes fun of them for thinking it's a serious revolution.
I mean, just think of it as another camp game, a game like...
Like capture the flag?
Exactly.
And no one wants to be ostracized as a kid who takes everything too seriously. So you wind up maximizing participation and minimizing dissent. The actual overthrow is quick and takes place during a game where the counselors and kids switch places. Ham Pumpernickel gives a sermon at lunch and asks if there are any requests while he's acting as camp leader. And this is when the coiled snake strikes.
Free Chris Wade!
Mr. Warren has had enough of this foo-for-ah and threatens to throw the whole lot of them in the brig, where Franklin has found Mr. Warren's gun and turns the tables. The counselors are shoved into the brig without anyone outside the conspiracy really being aware, so only the conspirators get to control the narrative. For those who still do have qualms about the revolution and don't find it fun, there is always the promise that it's only temporary and it's going to end soon.
Let's just wait one more day. Franklin swears he's gonna call off in the morning, okay?
In 1996, Purdue University's Bill Muir published findings of a long-term experiment on animal husbandry. Muir was a geneticist and biologist, but in this experiment he was focused on animal behaviors. Purdue resides in the state of Indiana, which contains large farming communities. This means that Purdue often researches best practices in areas like the raising of chickens. Muir theorized that chicken behaviors and temperament could be linked to egg production. As part of the experiment, Muir divided chickens into two personality types. Red zone chickens were the assertive, high-performing chickens. They produced the most eggs in their group. He then bred those chickens with other highly competitive alphas and allowed them to live in their own community. He did this over the course of a year, constituting 5 generations of chickens. In the other community were the green zone chickens. These chickens produced far fewer eggs as individuals, but they engaged in more pro-social behaviors, sharing shelter and food, ensuring the safety of younger chickens, and collaborating more frequently. The prevailing wisdom at the time was that the highly competitive, highly performing chickens, when bred with other high performers, would create super performers that would lay massive amounts of eggs. Instead, the red zone chickens increased their red zone behaviors, becoming hyper-territorial, pecking each other's feathers off, and, in many cases, killing one another. For obvious reasons, overall egg production waned for this group. Unfettered by the toxic and abusive behaviors of the red zone chickens, the green zone chickens thrived even more, increasing their overall egg production by 260%. The green zone chickens were happier, living longer, and less likely to be focused on mere survival. This allowed them to focus on egg production. The lesson of the experiment, for chickens and humans alike, is that fear, threats, defensive communication, low trust, high blame, and internal conflict are not sustainable ways to organize a group in the long term. The organization, the team, the city, the state, the nation will eventually burn its time and resources on internal power struggles instead of advancing the overall benefits of its members. The organization loses profit, the team loses games, and the nation loses stability. And that's exactly what happens at Camp North Pines. Initially, all of the older kids are on the same page. At the talent show, the South Pine girls do a rendition of an original song, inviting the boys to go down south for a good time. And the boys later sneak over to the camp to make out with them. After the fall of the Warren regime, though, there are no rules, and Franklin struggles to keep people under control. This culminates when Stanley Runk accidentally kills Warren with his knife when Warren tries to escape, and they have to make a plan to hide the body. Similarly, John Mason assaults a girl named Debbie in the woods and barely even denies it. With no justice system in place, though, the camp has no way to punish John. Debbie demands that he be put to death, only to be told by Franklin that death isn't a fair punishment. And in one of the great lines that survives from the book,
"And I say he deserves to die, and if you don't want to hear it, then quit asking me."
And that's one of the ironies that runs through both the book and the movie. Franklin overthrows a stodgy old conservative regime in the name of fun and hedonism, only to be mired in paperwork and tough decisions. His compromise with the girls is to punish John Mason with a trial by ordeal. If he can cross the rickety bridge, he lives. If not, the canyon gets him. Of course, this is an incredibly stupid form of justice that only favors the physically strong and has nothing to do with evidence, morality, or social cohesion. The girls collectively start throwing rocks at Mason, but he still makes it back across and gloats right in Debbie's face. The injustice of it all prompts the girls to pounce on John Mason and carry him off into the woods for some primal, feral justice. Donald stumbles upon his lynched corpse later that night. In the novel, of course, it is Dawn Egress who gets lynched after being falsely accused of by a white girl at camp. This book being published and set 6 years after the Emmett Till murder. And that unpredictability of justice, of any kind of service the government provides, is an insurmountable bug in fascism. In order to get the benefits of belonging to a society, you have to be in the leader's good graces. And as Winston says in the book, that seems to shift daily because Franklin is, quote, the moodiest guy I ever met. So from a member standpoint, you're not getting any other things that you need from belonging to the group. You have other members who have been incentivized to be predatory towards you, and you could randomly be branded an enemy of the state for looking at someone the wrong way. Eventually, you're gonna turn against the revolution and back towards some kind of order where you can relax, sip your iced tea, and cornhole your way through the summer. The volatility of living moment to moment is just too stressful. And if you were discontent under the old regime, what in the hell are you now? That ultimately is the decision that Dr. Melfi makes. What happens to her is unfair and barbaric, and throughout the episode she dreams of a vicious dog just waiting to be unleashed on her attacker. But in the end, she decides not to tell Tony, to live with her ex-husband grousing about the system, to live with her son beating his chest, to live with her therapist patronizingly judging her for how her rage manifests.
Oh, don't worry. I'm not going to break the social compact.
To live with the knowledge that the system is but in the long run, it's better than the alternative of turning justice over to a mob that you can't control and is just as likely to turn on you. Just ask Don Egris. In the book, Don Egris's death is the final injustice that makes Winston go full counter-revolutionary and plot to kill Franklin. In the film, Donald witnesses John Mason being carried off by the girls to be disappeared, and everyone is too fried to care about where he went. When Donald stumbles across Mason's body dangling from a tree, that's when he knows that things have gone too far. He runs off to find Golden Boy Chris Wade, who is living in sin with his new girlfriend in the woods, and they agree that Chris needs to make a run for help. I don't think it should be lost on anyone that, both in the book and in the film, while John Mason's sexual assaults are treated as serious and egregiously bad things, they are not the final straw that causes people to turn on the revolution. In fact, Winston implies that it's happened to several girls at the camp by the end of the story.
Besides, you'd have to lock 50 guys up if you put me away. There's a lot of this kind of stuff going on around here.
It is the aftermath, the resulting mob mentality, that's the breaking point. Donald, of course, is tried for treason for seeking help, and now he has to walk the bridge. But he has tiny little boy arms and carpal tunnel from all of the space invaders, so he doesn't stand a chance. Fortunately, Chris Wade and the cops swoop in to take over the camp, and the underground resistance movement quickly subdues the revolutionaries. The film just sort of ends here. The police thank Donald for contributing evidence with his recordings, and he catches the bus home with a, well, thank God that's over. In the book, Winston expresses more fear and confusion about what he was willing to do to Frank, and is haunted by how easily he bought in the first place. Like America a mere 16 years after World War II, Winston is left grappling with how people, himself included, could have let this happen. Neither the book nor the movie offer much in the way of explanation. The book seems to exist just to warn us that it's not all that difficult to slide into fascism, and it could just as easily happen here. In 1961, mind you. The movie tries to stretch itself past what it's capable of in the same way that Corman's later Fantastic Four adaptation went far beyond the budget it could handle. Trying to cram a 2-hour prestige allegory film about fascism into a slasher movie grocery bag means that the film flows at a breakneck pace and never gets boring, but it's also not letting the story breathe, which it needs to desperately. All the major events from the book keep happening, but no one has any time to digest them before the next plot point. Ultimately, the story of fascism in both mediums is a cautionary tale. Not just about grand ideologies, but about the individual choices that paved their way. The profound question isn't how did it happen, but what do we do now? A question that demands more than just a historical understanding. It demands active, conscious engagement with the world around us. Stay cool, stay safe, wash your hands, return your shopping carts, make good choices, and I'll see you next time.